For the last 3 years, between recording segments of the D6 generation, Russ, Craig, and Raef have had various conversations that have spanned the interests of gamerdom worldwide. This is one of those conversations.
D6G, The Lost Chapters.
Hello and welcome to the D6G Lost Chapters number 8.
Man.
I know, right? And
how'd we get there?
We have good news and bad news today.
Yes.
The bad news is that our friend Craig is off gallivanting on one of the 7 seas there on some large vessel, as they say.
Yep.
The good news is, however, we have Ross Watson from Fantasy Flight Games on sitting in for Craig. How you doing, Ross?
Hello. I'm doing great. How are you guys?
That's awesome. You know, Russ,
yes.
Change his O to a U, and he could be you next.
Russ Watson. Yes. We'll just rotate Ross through the thing here.
Yeah, we'll just rotate him through. Does that mean I get a break in about a month?
No, you never get a day off. That's the rule.
I already hear rumors of who my stand-in is already. Do you know that, Ross? They already have my stand-in. I already know who it is.
Yeah.
Is it Romeo?
Nope. I'm going to keep it secret. Don't say Romeo.
Right,
okay.
So now, I don't think Ross really needs an introduction, but if for some reason this is the first D6G thing you've ever listened to, but we know it's not because it's a lost chapter, just go out and search for Ross's name on our website, and you'll find all the various interviews we've had with Ross. Mm-hmm. But first, Ross, I'd like to welcome you to Dunkin' Donuts here.
Well, thank you.
And would you like a latte or perhaps a donut?
Definitely both. Yes.
Okay. Now, let me ask you this. In Minnesota, do they actually have Dunkin' Donuts out there?
They do not.
They don't. So I know it's kind of a New England thing, and they actually sort of rose up and fought back Krispy Kreme when they showed up here, and sort of a very sort of strange Pittsburgh. What kind of donut places do they have out there in Minnesota?
The Great Donut Wars. I remember them well.
Yes.
For donuts out here, pretty much you got your choice of various grocery stores, Byerly's, etc.
Wow, no dedicated donut shops. Wow.
Not really, no.
What kind of barren wasteland is Minnesota?
What do you guys do for when you need a Dunks run?
Right.
Well, there is a couple of great bakeries. There's the Roseville Bakery, which is right next to me, and we bring in donuts to the shop occasionally for.
So like when you
guys
are, you're working away and you're working on some RPGs. It's getting a little late, and you're like, man, I could really go for a coffee. You just kind of go down to the local gas station, pour yourself a cup like you did in the old days, or.
Well,
let's assume that you don't want the K cups or whatever FFG has.
Well, you were asking about donuts, but for coffee, we do have Dunn Brothers and Starbucks relatively close by. Right. So there's a lot of coffee runs for those.
Yeah. Well, see, that's interesting you say that, Ross, because that's what surprised a lot of people when they come out to the East Coast. Is Dunkin' Donuts was originally, back when my grandmother was alive, was donuts, but now it's known for coffee. It's equivalent to, I would say, Starbucks. I'm not saying quality. I'm just saying as far as when people think they want to get a cup of coffee, they think here in the East Coast, Dunks.
Yeah, they kind of reinvented themselves.
They did. Yeah. They definitely did. Yep. I mean, we have so many. That's what shocks people. We have so many. You can have a Main Street Dunks, and then up at the next light, up the road where the mall is, you have a Main Street Dunks, and along the way, there'll be 3 Dunks inside gas stations.
It is
no
like
lie, right, Russ?
It's like coffee shops, yeah. Like you find Starbucks on the West Coast kind of thing. We have Starbucks too, but not as frequent.
We do, yep.
So
now, we're not here to talk about coffee, though.
No, we're not.
No.
Although we could go on for hours, and we probably shouldn't. So, Ross, today's topic comes from Ross. You mentioned you thought it'd be great to chat about GMing philosophy.
That's right. Actually, I got this idea while I was listening to you. I think it was last chapters, maybe 2 or 3, where you guys were discussing. I believe it was you were discussing the new Dungeons and Dragons board game.
Right.
And you brought up a concept called DM's Grace, and we'll get into that later. But as soon as you mentioned that and that particular topic, it started my mind turning about all the various things that I've run into over the years with regards to GMing and the philosophies behind it. And I said, man, that would be really fun to sit down and talk with the guys about that.
And so here we are. That'd be great.
Yeah, I'm excited about this topic. Awesome. I think this is going to be cool.
So one thing we want to be clear about, and I think this sort of dovetails into one of the early topics, Ross, you wanted to talk about, was there's no really right way or wrong way to GM, or is there? So, Ross, what do you think about the idea that there's really only one way to play an RPG?
Well, there's a common concept amongst various people on the internet, people in general, I would say, And among RPGers, this term has come to be known as the one true way-ism.
Ooh.
Where if you're not playing it the way that this person believes you should, you're doing it wrong.
Oh, okay.
Right.
That's the definition of the term. But I just want to make it clear to everybody before we jump in with both feet into the philosophies of game mastering that none of us, I'm going to speak for all of us in this one moment, but none of us believe that, what we are saying is applicable to everyone everywhere. It's what works for us.
That's right. Yeah, it's totally right.
I would absolutely agree with what you just said, but when first posed, as Russ said it, I was thinking, no, there's I could think of 5 wrong ways to DM. Not as to Rafe, but that I think a majority of gamers would say, oh, man, that's not fun. Don't do it that way. But everything you just said, the way you phrased it, I agree.
Okay.
Welcome to Chalking with Rafe, Russ.
Well, I can give you an example because I think all of you guys would say this would be a wrong way.
Right.
Would be actually, which is to Ross's point, which is okay. So I got feedback on my Death Watch game where I kind of minimized the Space Marines powers, and I agree. So in other words, I think that was wrong. So like if I were to DM like that, I think most people wouldn't have fun. So that's a wrong way to GM that game.
Well, Rafe, if it didn't work for you and that group, in that particular game, I think that's fair to say that, you believe that is not the right way that you would want to run that game.
Yeah, because I kind of railroaded it, in other words. That's the point I'm getting to. Exactly.
I've gamed with a lot of different people over a really long time. I've been role-playing for over 20 years. And I've encountered some people who go completely against, the common wisdom for running games, and I've had a heck of a lot of fun.
Okay, so that's interesting.
When you say that there's some things that are the wrong way, well, some people might say that an antagonistic approach between the DM and the players is the wrong way to game.
Yes, I would say that as well.
But I've actually been in games like that where it was incredibly fun.
No kidding. All right.
Yeah, it's just it takes the right person in the right group at the right time. But I just want to get this off on the right foot by saying we're not trying to tell people this is the only one true way to do things, or this is you're doing it wrong, right? We're not trying to be those people, are we?
So there may actually be no wrong way from what you just described. That's interesting. I could be open to that concept.
I think we were saying though. I think we're all saying the same thing in one respect, and that is that you want to make sure that everybody involved in the game knows what they're getting into, right? So if you've got players that are maybe into a more casual, non-competitive experience, and the GM is there, wants to play a, hey, you design the nastiest character possible, I'm going to try to kill you concept, that may not work out well, right? So maybe it's just a matter of making sure everybody knows where they're going with that. Is that sort of fair?
Yeah, there's a concept called the social contract where you and your players get together before the game and you talk about the expectations that you have and the expectations players have. And if you can get everyone to buy into this contract before the game begins, I have found in my experience that will really help smooth out the rough spots in your game.
Yeah, so let's go there, but let's just end the one true wayism by saying, I think, and Ross, I think you made this point very well, which is that I think one of the best parts of the RPG is there's really no right way to play it, right? So that's the beauty of it. If you and your players can agree to somehow with this social contract, then you can do whatever you want, and the rules be damned. As long as the rules inspire you to do something interesting with your friends, I think that's sort of the core of what an RPG is, right?
I think that it's about defining limits because RPGs are take place so much in the imagination, so much with the social aspects of you and your friends getting together and having a fun time, that it's very important to decide, where your limits lie or if you have them in the first place.
Right. So
okay. I'm open.
Yeah, so you talked about this idea of the social contract. So how does that happen? Is it a very formal thing where the players and DM sit down and say, here's what we're going to do, or is it a very casual thing, or does it change, or how does that sort of work with your groups?
Well, it's run the gamut in my experience. I've been in games where it's been very casual, where we say, okay, we're going to show up and we're going to play smugglers in outer space, and it worked. And I've been the GM when I have actually laid out, piece by piece, every step intentionally transparent to the players about what decisions I'm making and why, and that also worked really well. So it kind of is the social contract is the way that you as the GM decide to communicate with the players about the expectations they have, the expectations you have, and trying to get everyone together on the same page so you've all agreed that we're playing a particular game about X, Y, and Z.
Right. So kind of like it's exactly the kind of the style. It's more than just the story we're going to have, but it's also the style of the adventure too, right? It's like how the GM and the players are going to interact. Are we going to be adversarial? Are we going to be friendly? Are we going to have real player knowledge versus character knowledge and all those kind of is it going to be more of a mystery RPG? Is it going to be a combat heavy RPG? Does all that sort of factor into the social contract as you see it?
That's the way I like to do it. Yes, it involves both the metagame concepts of what's the genre, and what is the feel that we're going for here, along with the very specific, we're going to be adversarial or we're not going to be adversarial, or we're mostly looking for fun here. There's any term that you want to define ahead of time. This is where you would put it down in the social contract, just to help remove any misunderstandings.
Now, Rafe, does this fit in with your ideas? Okay, because I know you kind of like to sometimes, surprise the players with sort of a left field kind of approach. Does that work with the whole?
Well, that's what's interesting is I think that really, I guess to go back to my first point where I said no, there is a wrong way. I think now I'm going to take that back. I still do think there are wrong ways, but I don't want to eat up all the time. I'll say that from the end if there is. But perhaps what I did before we agree if there's a wrong way is I broke a social contract with Brian, Dave, Andy, blah, 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 or maybe even more specifically Craig and Dave, because Brian and Andy had an okay time. So, and I think the best way to illustrate that for me in my head is boxing. The social contract is these two guys can pudgel each other. They can punch each other and hurt each other and draw blood. We can't do that on the street. But in the boxing ring, within those four corners, you are allowed to punch the heck out of each other, even so much as to knock somebody out. But it breaks the social contract to punch the guy below the belt or in the nuts, cause him to fall down, and then kick him in the head.
Right.
That breaks the social contract of boxing. And then you could say, well, there's ultimate fighting, but those are different social contract rules.
Right.
So and actual rules, too.
Right.
And those have rules, too. And that's where we get into these very strange scenarios. I've been playing a lot of Flames of War where, you have war, where killing is allowed, but it's only allowed in a certain circumstance. Artillery shell, grenade, rifle bullet, but not if the person's a prisoner. So it's kind of strange when you think of these social contracts, but I like or how they can be broken. I like how Ross has framed this, because maybe that's what happened was I broke an unwritten social contract. Or maybe didn't I break it? Maybe I played to a different social contract. I GM'd as to a different social contract.
Well, I don't really want to be a Monday morning quarterback for your game.
Oh, but do it. Come on, it's fun. Here, have another donut.
But if I had to guess, and it would just be a guess, I would suggest that Craig and the other guys were probably expecting something different than what you were expecting.
Exactly.
And I think, if we had I think the social contract that you're talking about that would have addressed that might have been to get the guys together beforehand and say, in my mind, this is what I'm seeing when Space Marines do things, and I want you guys to be aware that you're going to have to deal with environmental factors and stuff like that. So you are these great heroes, but I want you to be involved with struggles that are not just shooting things.
Yes,
right. And maybe that might have I don't know. Again, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be Monday morning.
Right, and they could have been like, that's my best guess. Boring. We don't want to enter that boxing ring.
Well, I think, and maybe just as a tip here, and again, I'm with Ross, not to quarterback your game, but I think especially what maybe, and it could have just been, it's kind of like when we talk about miniature war games and we say, you look at the table and take a moment to clarify the terrain with your opponent, because in the middle of the game to be going, I thought the woods you couldn't see through that, it was woods. No, I was playing that as, transparent swamp. And all of a sudden you've got an argument in the middle of the game that could have easily been avoided in the beginning. And I think what may have happened here was not so much an argument, but, it was the first time, if you're going into the game for the first time, like you're doing, Space Marine and Death Watch for the first time, I think the players probably have the expectation that they're going to be playing in an environment where a Space Marine would be handy. Right. Where if it was your 12th campaign of Death Watch, you might be like ready for something a little more exotic or unusual, maybe. So maybe that was sort of the unwritten contract they had in their head that didn't get stated explicitly.
I think, Ross's point, the social contract, because, again, boxers don't get into the ring and say, okay, now I can hit you like this. It's all understood.
It's understood, right.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's part of the contract, too, which is how hard are we going to follow the rules as written in the book, right? Because a lot of times, and a lot of debates get over this, right, where some schools of thought are, hey, as you play, as a GM, don't get overly caught up in the exact methodology. If you're, don't spend 15 minutes trying to look up the exact reload time of a bolter. If in the middle of combat and it's going really smoothly and you don't want to pause the game, just sort of wing it. But then some players be like, no, we need to look that up right now and get it exactly right. And so is that something we agree that should be set up front? Are we going to be really hardcore into the rules, or are we going to be sort of more laid back about it?
That's a great question.
I've seen it happen both ways. I like where Russ is going with the original, comparison to like miniature games. Like you just have a different expectation if you show up to a tournament than if you do to playing a friendly game with your buddy in his basement.
Sure. Yep. And
just like going to a tournament, it's when you play a game with guys that you don't know as well, maybe, or in a system that you haven't tried in a long time. It would be important to get down rules questions, especially if you're doing it for the first time. So maybe you would try and keep something in the contract, about how we're going to handle if something comes up and we don't understand it. Should we wait till we're done and talk about it after, or should we pause the game and talk about it then? Right. I've seen it done both ways.
Well, that's an excellent point, Russ, because there are some players where like you're like, no, that is not how flanking works. It's +2, and if you're in a cloud, it would be -0.5, and they would have missed. And other players are like, oh, come on, man, who cares if it's a 0.5? He got it close enough. And I want the story to continue.
And that's part of the social contract too, because I think it's totally legit.
It is. I
don't want to be judgmental here and say, well, of course you should let the DM be slack or the player, because sometimes it may be the desire of the group to really learn the rules cold, and so we want to pause the game and really learn the rules. And even in whether it's a miniature game or an RPG, that happens, right? Where you're like, no, let's pause it and really get it right. But also it can be very, very frustrating when the combat's moving, the story's moving quick, and then the DM just makes an off-the-cuff ruling, and a player's like, well, actually, on page 37, it clearly states, please, and then you're like, awkward, right? Because hey, what do you do, right? Because the guy's technically correct, but he just broke the moment, so it's...
what's funny about that is my personal preference. This might get into something that we talk about a little later on. People might be surprised about this. I'm quite a rule stickler. I don't want the GM fluffing off the rules. And the example I would give for that is where somebody's at the top of a parapet that's 1,000 feet up, and they describe this wonderful role-playing moment, and they're like, yeah, okay, I'll let you wall slide down 1,000 feet. Go ahead, make a dex roll. Oh, you missed it. Oh, but you know what? That's okay. You described it so well, I'm going to allow it. Oh, I hate that, unless the game has fate points or one heroic moment or something like that. I don't like it when GMs just suddenly go off book and there's like, come on. I'm like, you can only wall slide like maybe 20 feet.
Well, Rafe, that's a great segue into a topic that Ross talked about earlier, which is the idea of GM's grace, right?
Yeah.
So the idea, and I mentioned this in another show, and I've heard the term used before. I don't know, Ross, am I making this up, or have you heard this term before too?
I've never heard it before.
I've heard it called different things, but I instantly knew what it was as soon as you mentioned it.
So the idea is basically that the GM is sometimes can take it into his purview to help the characters in some small way if there's something really bad about to happen. Like, for example, if you're rolling in the open, and we can talk about this in a second, and so the GM rolls the monster to hit, and you've been playing the campaign for 15 years, and you've developed your character, and it's been and seriously, and you got this guy you've been looking for, and the monster rolls a natural 20, and your 15-year-old paladin's is getting hit by the monster, and the circumstance comes to the situation where he's going to kill you, and you're going to die. And by the rules of the game and the situation you're in, you will die.
And even worse, you're going to die by like drowning or something.
Well, whatever, it's going to happen. It doesn't even matter. You're going to die. The DM, for whatever reason, could say, well, circumstance, but if he rolls in the open like that, he's got to openly kind of put on the table and say, yep, I'm going to change fate here. Or you can play the game with the dice hidden, right? And then when the GM rolls, no one actually sees the dice the GM rolls. So he could roll a natural 20 for the monster and go, I'm not going to do that to them. He's a great player. He's been doing that. I'm just going to re-roll it, or I'm going to say it's a 19 instead, or do 2 points less of the damage and keep the guy just alive, just hanging on by a thread. So what do we feel about the concept of GM's Grace, and how does it make the game better, worse, different? Or
I'm going to speak first and then let Ross go. I don't like it unless there's a rule for it, and I'll speak more later.
What do you think, Ross?
Well, I actually wrote a whole article on this subject for Knights of the Dinner Table magazine a while back.
Cool.
Several years ago, actually. And this came from some experiences that I had playing a game with a particular game master who chose to roll everything out in the open.
Right.
And it really opened my eyes to a lot of things about why rolling in the open is different from rolling behind the screen, and how that made me feel. Ultimately, I really enjoy and I am a proponent of rolling in the open.
So basically, you're feeling that it just feels like there's a level of control that is lost by everyone, and that's okay. I mean, you know what I mean? That's the way you want it?
Well, the reason, I can go in, this is going to take me a couple minutes to really get into, but
okay, go for it.
The reason why I like rolling in the open better than behind the screen is because when you roll in the open, I feel like all the risks and rewards are that much more significant to my character. I mean, I know that if I'm going to go into battle with the Lich, that I can't depend on the GM stepping in for me. It's going to be down to my decisions and my choices.
Oh, that's interesting.
That makes it whether I will live or whether I will die. And it really, like I said, it opened my eyes to the whole thing of sort of separating out between, allowing the DM to choose whether he was going to fudge in my favor or fudge against me, and just make it about what my choices were and how that was going to affect the outcome. Because the things that you do, I'm sorry, really quick.
Go ahead. Keep going.
The things that you do can affect that dice roll. You can gain bonuses and so forth. So you're weighing the odds of what you're doing, and you can't. It's not like you're just giving yourself up to the fates. The things you choose to do affect how likely it is for you to succeed.
But this is very interesting to me because when you first said that, I was like, I couldn't disagree more. But when you just stated your reasons of why you like rolling in the open, I agreed with you 100%. So let me explain the dichotomy. How do you handle the following scenario? Because you just said if you roll in the open, so this is not, I'm agreeing with you, I'm confirming you. What you just said, when you roll in the open, it adds the drama. The GM can't fluff it. If you make a critical error, you're going to pay the price because the dice is right there. Did I understand that part?
Well, yes, but
okay.
I think it's, yeah.
So how do you handle, because I like that as well. How do you, and I do some of my rolling in the open for that reason. Like, okay, you got poisoned, go ahead. Here's what you need to roll to make it. And there's a lot of drama behind that person's roll. But what do you do about the thief hiding in shadows? If I roll my opposing check in the open, the thief knows, he spotted me. Doesn't that change how the thief's going to play? Because he may take 3 turns thinking he's hiding in shadows the whole time he's been spotted by the monster. How do you handle that scenario?
Well, if I understand you correctly, Rafe, you're talking about some metagame decisions that players make based on, whether you're rolling dice or whether you're not, or whether they're rolling dice or whether they're not.
In the open.
Because everything's in the open.
Yes. No, not rolling dice, but the decisions they would make because yes, that's right.
The metagame decisions, because their character wouldn't know.
Right.
Correct.
Well, in that case, I mean, that is kind of a larger issue with people metagaming that kind of decision.
Right. Player knowledge versus character knowledge, right? Do your players go ahead. Because basically what Ross is saying is, yes, the player would see that the DM is rolling a spot check for the orc to see if the thief's hiding in shadows, and he just saw the DM roll a 20, so the player knows he's been spotted. However, the player should theoretically play his character as if he does not know. Is that what you're saying?
Oh, I never thought of that as a solution.
Is that right, Ross? Is that what you're saying?
Well, that's a solution. There's a lot of ways to address this. I mean, some GMs I know have just made a habit of making various dice rolls. and not necessarily telling us what they're for, but you know, they'll be like, okay, I need to make a check here, and they just roll a dice, and they'd be like, and they'd note something down on a notepad, and you wouldn't necessarily know what that is.
I never thought of that either.
But that opens up DM's grace again, though, because then I could be saying, well,
good point.
That 20 you saw me roll 3 turns ago, that was the one I needed for you to succeed when you did your spot check, or
That's
I could say,
a good point.
That one, doesn't that kind of...
That is kind of abrogating the whole, you know, the fudging bit. So
it's an open screen.
I don't really recommend that as a solution.
But I think we're dancing around your earlier point though, which is that, you know, that's, and Rafe's got a point there, right? There's these ancillary issues, but when it comes right down to it, and you're all in, you know, the giant chamber fighting Tiamat, whatever you're doing, right? Mm-hmm. And all the rules are in the open. Okay, that means, you know, your sword swings in the open, the dragon's breath weapon's in the open, everybody sees it, and if the whole party sees that they all just rolled 1s and missed, and we see the DM, you know, breathe breath weapons whatever you had, and they all roll 20s, everybody knows what just happened there, and there's no fudging it, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
But doesn't that, and I get what you're saying, and I totally understand that, but doesn't that take the game a little bit away from the storytelling mode and put it more into this tactical RPG, tactical board game mode? I mean, isn't that one of the critiques of D&D 4E, which is it feels more like a tactical game than a storytelling game, and aren't you, by doing that, you're really saying, well, I really don't want to describe myself as, you know, swinging off the lamp and jumping on the dragon's back. What I really want to say is I got to maneuver just so I get the maximum bonuses and flanking bonuses to hit, and it all comes down to game mechanics and less storytelling.
No, I don't think so, but Ross, you speak first.
Well, I think what's happening in that case is you got people that are looking at what it takes. You know, it all kind of boils down to whether you trust the GM or not. Because if the GM has got a story in mind, right, and he wants to tell that story regardless of what the dice say, then he's going to want to use the screen. He's going to want to fudge. Right. He's going to want to use the GM's grace. Okay. And that's because that's that style of game that works for him and his group, and there's nothing wrong with that. The type of game that I generally prefer for myself, though, is one where the story is a collaborative effort between the players and the GM. Mm-hmm. And by allowing me to sort of make my decisions more significant in that the roles are all in the open and I take the good with the bad, you know, that kind of lets us both sort of decide, well, yes, we went up against Tiamat and we died. It happens. Right. But on the other hand, there are a lot of games that just allow you to sort of come back from the dead. And
right, sure. Yeah.
So it kind of depends on what game you're playing and what exactly is at stake.
Well, and then GM's grace can come in from a different direction, right? Because you died, but fortunately there was a nearby cleric with a resurrection scroll, you know, or whatever. So there's other ways that the party could be rescued. In other words, right? I mean,
see, that's what. I think it's, and of course, you know, I was gonna be like, oh, of course, Rafe, but like whether dice are rolled in the open or closed, it's still up to, like, Russ, you're always very good at this. No matter if the dice are rolled behind the screen or in front of the screen, you're never like, I walk up 5 paces and I swing my sword. Oh, look, I got an 18 plus my bonuses. You know, you're like, I say avast ye, and I charge and I swing, and you roll the dice and you're like, ooh, I hit. You know, That's it. You role play in the moment.
I guess it really comes down to, and part of this, we were framing it all in the idea of GM's grace and do we all want to know what's on the line every dice roll, and I think it's one way to frame it. But I think another very reasonable approach, and again, there's no right or wrong way, right, is a lot of GMs like to roll behind the screens, not only for themselves, but also for the players.
Yes,
because
that's why I do
they like to remove the mechanics from the player's thought.
Yes.
And say, it is a story, and you don't need to be concerned too much with your stats. Build the character you would like to play, and the DM will worry about the rules. But that's a very different experience, too. So, Ross, what do you think about that kind of play style?
Wait, Ross, before you jump in, because it'll add to what Russ said. That's exactly how I do it. I do the dice in front of the screen or behind the screen based on the drama of the moment. So, like, making that critical saving throw will be open. But like behind the scene mechanics are, don't worry about that. Just play your game.
Well, I think I would really enjoy playing in your game, Rafe. But I think a lot of that is because I trust you.
That's very true. I do have a lot of trust.
I wouldn't have any issues with, you know, deciding whether you were, you know, making a decision on whether to fudge in my favor or against me based on
I don't fudge.
Whether you liked me or not. It would be something about the story.
No, I don't even fudge.
Yeah. And going back just really briefly to, you know, one of Russ's biggest it felt like one of Russ's biggest issues was the idea that, if you have all the rules in the open, then failures, especially mass failure or total party kill, is entirely possible. One of my best DMs and good friends, and he's in fact in the gaming industry. His name's Dave Mattingly. He runs Blackworm Games.
Oh, cool.
He had a great piece of advice for me, and that I've never forgotten. And that piece of advice is that failure is simply another opportunity for the player characters to do something awesome.
That's a good point.
So, if everyone dies facing Tiamat, a good GM could probably think of a way to make that into an opportunity to do something awesome.
Right.
I'm not going to say, I'm not going to come out and say that this is what you should do in your game because, as we defined it earlier, but I think the games that I've experienced in my time would definitely cater to that.
Interesting. That's cool. So yeah, I think that's great. I think it is important. I think we're all in agreement though that it's the reason that dice are involved in these things is that you want the ability for fate to direct the story a little bit, so it's not a predetermined thing. And
it's reminded me, and I know we have so much more to cover, but it's reminded me about character death. That is the one thing and I forgot this one time, I should have. It's the one thing that I say to my players is I'm like, your characters can die in my games. They can die, and you could all die. And I should have said, and you could die by water. Like I have had dwarves fully armored get into a boat, and the monster tips the boat, and the dwarf drowns because he's not in 4 feet of water. It's like 20 feet of water, and they're like, "Oh man, I can't believe it! I died because I'm drowning." I'm like, "Dude, you're wearing plate mail."
Yeah.
And that's an interesting thing because what I have designed in that is to say, hey, dwarf, you got to take that plate mail off. Number one, it gives the thief or the mage character who's wearing robes a little bit of an advantage in that little scenario, and the dwarf has to learn to fight without his armor, and anyway. But yeah,
well, that's a good segue too, Rafe, into another area I really wanted to cover, which is the idea that killing characters, and I think I agree with both of you that it should definitely be possible for characters to die. I mean, one of my favorite moments in the movie Serenity, and here's a spoiler alert, is when all the fans when Walsh died, right when Walsh died when Serenity went down and crashed, and he just instantly dead. Okay, that was a great moment because suddenly everyone in the series is at risk.
The rules have changed.
You suddenly realize that no one needs to make it out of here alive.
Just like the George R.R. Martin novels.
Right. And so what you want in a role-playing game is you do need, and I'm with you, we had a DM game go on for years. I mean, years, like 8 years. And about, 6 months into it, one of the guys did a stupid move, and we were camping out. He's like, I'm going to sleep on the wall, and killed at night, died in his sleep, throat cut. And that totally changed. We got so serious about it after that. We were totally worried. So you definitely want that threat. But let me ask you this. So another thing that came up back in another Lost Chapter or show, or whatever we were talking about before, was this idea of, we talked about the D&D board games. I mentioned the idea that I like that it's co-op because for me, it felt like a RPG because in my head, the GM of an RPG is an ally to the players, or at least a guide. And this comes from, I'm informed from this show.
I am Dungeon Master, your guide in the realm of Dungeons and Dragons.
So as a young lad watching that silly Saturday morning cartoon, I was totally that was the way I decided it should be, that the Dungeon Master is your guide. And so, well, even with Rolling in the Open, and I've played Rolling in the Open too, and I do enjoy it also, the DM, though, is not your opponent. He's just like, oh, yeah, you fumbled. Sorry to see that. It's not, you fumbled, now my dragon's going to kill you. You know what I mean? It's a sort of subtly different thing. What do you guys think about that? Is the DM, is it a collaborative effort between the players and the DM, or is the DM an adversary, or is it both, or is it part of the contract? You figure out at the beginning, or what do you guys think?
First of all, I miss Craig because he could make the unicorn noise probably. Ross, are you able to make that unicorn noise?
No, and just to be clear, I'm not a replacement for Craig. I'm just sort of pitch hitting for him in one instance. So I really wish he was here too.
So what do you think? Is it should it be an adversarial role, or is it an ally role, or is it somewhere in the middle?
Ross, you go first.
Well, I think it depends on the game and the group. Like I said, I've been in groups where the GM was very adversarial. And it has I've seen it go where it's been really fun, and I've seen it where it's been really bad. It just depends on what you want to do. Now, for me personally, what I prefer to do as a GM, I prefer to be an enabler for the players to have a moment of awesome every game session.
Right.
That's kind of how I see myself.
Now, do you target? I do that too, and my brother does that, and that's one of the reasons I've enjoyed playing in his games for over the years. Do you actually think of moments of awesomes for individual characters, or do you sort of feel it for the group?
Well, I try to do it kind of both ways. My go-to example is I ran a game called Shadows Angelus, and you can just plug that into Google and you can find the groups that we made for this game. We ran it for almost 2 years.
Wow.
And the way I did it is I had individual story arcs for each character, and we had story arcs that involved the organization that the characters belong to. But inside that, what you would try to do is you would try to find a way in every adventure. You would try to find a way to make it to where there was multiple ways to approach a solution, and whoever chose to approach the solution in a way that you saw an opportunity to make it awesome, you could do that.
Right. Yeah, I kind of look at it the same way. So, I guess there's two ways to look at it. And Rafe, I thought of this when you were talking about the Great Mudslide incident, which is the idea that does the DM look at for moments to really let an individual player shine? This guy's playing a thief and he's really good at his thief, and wouldn't it be great to have a moment where his guy could really shine in this particular dungeon or area? But then also there's the idea of, do you want to create moments of particular challenge for a particular character? Like that fighter is always walking through monsters and just killing them like nobody's business. I want to put a creature in here that's really going to, put a problem in his way they can't deal with his typical ways of doing things.
Yep.
And Rafe, that sounds sort of like what you like to do more, but is that typical for you? Do you like to do both methodologies? Or
No, definitely. I see my role as to create, I like your list here, to create an interesting set of challenges for the players. And then their moments to shine or their moments to fail will occur as they interact with what my brainchild is. So my brainchild is not something that cannot be tampered with. It's supposed to be tampered with. And I get enjoyment when I'm like, oh, I never thought they would do that. That's awesome.
Right.
And then I just let them run with it. And so that dwarf plate, and I guess I didn't even realize I do this till now. I won't throw a harder monster at them because that's for the dwarf. What does the poor thief do? He's going to get squished. So I will usually try to challenge that player by using an environmental challenge, or I didn't even realize that till just now. Or perhaps I'll throw, if he's a little greedy with magic items, well, I'll give him an amulet that's -2 and he doesn't even know it to his armor rating or something like that.
Okay, cool. Now, Ross, I think what happens though is depending on whether you're going to put more challenges in there, and we talked earlier that if you're rolling in the open and you're putting these hard challenges in there, and characters are going to die. I mean, what kind of issues do you think come with the risk of character death, or what advantages come from it?
Well, it depends on the type of game you're playing. A lot of my friends, when I was playing in Maryland, I had a very good gaming group in Maryland, and we had been playing superhero games for a really long time. And the general trope of superhero games is that characters don't really die.
Yeah, they don't really die.
They're defeated, or they're put in jail, but people just don't really get killed.
That's comic books, except until very recently, right?
And even then, they're still not dead.
Right.
Even if they don't find the body, right? But
right.
The point is that was sort of the mindset that people had gotten into, is that we don't play games where our characters die. But then I came along and I decided to run a game of horror. Shadows Angelus is a game where you play cops in the dark future fighting Lovecraftian monsters.
Oh, cool.
And I wanted to really make it my experiment at running a horror game. So I told the guys up front, I'm like, I want this to be a horror game, and that means that there has to be a risk of your character dying. And I actually got a lot of resistance about this from one particular player. He's like, no, I put a lot of work into this character. I don't want to just have him get killed. That seems bad to me. I don't want to do that. At least let me control how I die, is the argument he made to me.
Right.
And I said, that's a very interesting argument. And in a lot of games, it would be a very reasonable agreement from the GM to just say, yes, if you die, I will make sure it is awesome.
Right. Epic.
In this particular case, though, the game I was aiming for, the social contract I was building with my players, was I wanted this to be a game where you were really worried about what was going to happen to you, and to sort of foster that fear and apprehension. So I said, no, I think the decision we need to make here is that you can die at any time to anybody.
Yeah. And
once he kind of got his head around that, he was like, okay, I see what you're going for there. And he was fine with it, from that point on. But it depends, it depends a lot on the game. If you're playing a game where characters are very, making a character is very easy and you don't have a lot of investment into it, death is, probably a lot less of an issue than if you've written, a 10-page background for him.
Well, see, I have found that I get cut by my own sword, so I tell people, okay, your characters can die. Well, what does that make the characters do? They don't become that invested. So they don't necessarily role play or get into their character that much because they don't want to get too attached because it can die. So it can kind of cut the other way.
I found that as if there are real risks, then people get really, they find a lot of return coming to them on their triumphs.
Right.
And the failures loom that much more,
Exactly.
The game just sort of becomes a lot more intense if there's a real risk involved.
I think so too.
It all goes
and it's
back.
important to mention we're talking about character death, not player death.
Right. We're not killing players. That's wrong. We know what's great though about this, and you're mentioning the social contract game came back and reminded me one of my favorite RPG experiences ever was at a con, and we're rolling the characters up right there, right? So it's you're not going to be that vested because you're going to play for a few hours, half a day, and you're done. But the game was Paranoia. Have you played this game before, Russ?
Yes.
And this is a fantastic game to play at a con because not only is the social contract, they said this up front, not only is the social contract that you may die, but you may die at another player's hand. I mean, not you personally, but your character, at another character's hand, right? So
it's very likely you will die.
In fact, you will. And in fact, your motivation is you're going to kill. And so you are collaborating with the GM to literally kill other characters in the game. It's just, and it was so much fun and literally so paranoid. And yet you are, to your point, Rafe, I was, and I think the other characters were too, trying to role play a way your character would try to get you. You weren't just trying to, shoot someone randomly. You had to kind of do it in a way that would impress the GM or not impress them. In a con, you're kind of trying to be the not uncool guy. So it was really interesting experience, and I really enjoyed it. And that was a game where the dice are in the open. You're not trying. There's no GM's grace because who are you going to be grace for? I mean, you're between two characters. So who's the GM going to side with you? Nobody.
Yeah.
So it was really interesting. It was a lot of fun, but there was a lot of hidden roles too because the characters are like hiding and priming grenades on other guys' seats and stuff. So you can't. It was really funny situation. But that made me think of the idea that when character death is possible, it does change a lot of the options in the game and how it's going to feel.
Right, and you mentioned something a while back, Russ, where you were saying that I think you kind of made the assumption that we all agreed that character death is something that should be in every game. And I'm just going to say I think that is true for most of my games, but just to point out there are some games like some 4-color superheroes or maybe a wild martial arts Hong Kong cinema style game where character death may not be on the table.
I was just thinking that. Because I would have said before this conversation, oh, no, I got to have character death. But Ian is running a Mutants and Mastermind game, and I was really intrigued with that after the interview. I've never played a superhero game, and I think it's because I assumed it would be boring because the character can't die. But now I'm thinking, well, you know what? Wait a minute. I could be thrown in jail. I could lose my powers. It's not going to necessarily be boring.
Well, you could be the bumbling fool instead of the competent hero. You could end up being a sidekick, right? But I think also this comes back to it comes to style too. Even in a campaign game, like any game, Death Watch or D&D or whatever. If you've been playing it for a long, long time and you've built up these characters over years, and maybe character death's always been on the table, but everybody's been fortunate enough to never actually die, and their character is now, been in with players for years and years. I think there becomes a social contract, perhaps, that you may still die, but it will be glorious. You're not going to – because at that point you've written a novel essentially with everyone, and no one wants to see the hero die in a boat in the end of the novel. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like there sort of becomes this sort of implied – it's got to be Tiamat or you're not – you know what I mean?
Of course, to Rafe's theory, you didn't die in a boat because you weren't stupid.
Well, you're right. I mean, obviously.
Along the way.
Yeah, I mean, you
Hence
can't
your character made
it,
it to level 8.
Yeah, the character can't do something so blatantly out. I mean, you can't call the DM out and say, I double dog dare you not to kill me. Jumping into a plate with plate mail,
Yeah, I'm going to jump from a 1,000-foot parapet without feather fall. Okay.
Right.
It definitely changes your expectation of the game if you know that character death is possible, and if you know how that's going to be handled.
Does it get harder to kill characters as it goes on?
Well,
no, I don't think so.
That's
you mean
that's
emotionally, or
I think I just implied it does, right? Because I mean, as DMs as players get more vested in their characters, it must become harder to see them die for anybody at the table. I mean, you feel bad, right?
Well, it makes more of an impact.
Right.
I think I would definitely say that.
So we're starting to run along. We're starting to finish your thought, Russ. I'm sorry.
No. I was only going to say that it can be really hard otherwise too, because in Shadows Angeles we ran for 2 years, and I tried my darndest to kill those guys, and I really didn't manage to do it.
Well, that happens too, right? It becomes a point where the characters get so powerful and you can't seem to stop them that you suddenly start, throwing minor deities out and stuff.
It's not a question of power, because the DM is always more powerful.
Yeah.
They were just smarter than I was.
There you go. Well, that's good. Well, it's good as a DM that you didn't ever outclass them just blatantly. So let's, before we run out of time and Dunks or whatever you have there in Minnesota kicks us out, let's talk about what GM philosophy do you employ to deal with sort of the challenging players. Okay, so now most of the time, I mean, if Craig were here, I kind of think he would say, well, I wouldn't play with them.
That's what I would say.
But is there a case, or do you ever get in a situation where, let's say, I'm sure, Ross, you've had the situation where you probably run your demos at a con or whatever, and you've got or it's not always an ideal situation where you can kick someone out. How do we deal with troubled players, like in those situations, or how do you address that? Or do you want an example?
As I mentioned before, I've been gaming a really long time, and I've been the problem player before.
Right. Well, I think we all have, right? Let's be honest. I know I've been the rules lawyer guy a few times. I'm not going to lie.
So it's easy for someone to say you should always kick him out.
Right.
And I think there's going to be as many ways to handle this as there are groups out there, and because everybody's different. But my preferred tactic would be to communicate with the guy and just sort of, you go back to that social contract a little bit and say, listen, my experience or my expectations of this game are being affected by your behavior, and I'd like to see if we can address that.
You just call them out, basically. Just
talk to them about it.
Yeah, right.
That would be my first step.
Now, how do you deal with something that's like, I think the rules lawyer is an easy one, right? Not easy, but if the guy's reasonable, you kind of take him aside and say, look, we're, here was sort of the deal, and maybe we didn't set this up in the beginning, but I, want to be able to make rules. All the players agree we're going to play fast and loose. That's fine. But what about the situation where you have a person where you're in the scenario, and we didn't talk about this too much, but the idea of player knowledge versus character knowledge. Mm-hmm. And, when I was younger, we used to always play that, whenever someone scouted ahead, then the rest of the group would go sit in the other room and play Atari 2600, right? While you and your one player would experience the thing, and then they'd all come back in the room, and only the thief would have known what happened, right? Mm-hmm. But as you get older, it feels like you start doing that less and less, and it's just like, okay, that you play with that person, everybody's sitting there and kind of hears the whole thing, but they don't really know what's happening, right?
I do really think that's an age thing, because I do remember that too, and I remember it to be really exciting when you were the one left in the room, right, and really exciting when you weren't the one. But nowadays, since we don't want to hog glory moments, which is what kids tend to want to do, like, I found the magic sword, now, or maybe that was just my game group. Now, like, all that happens, Russ, you're like, okay, I was in the room and I found this and I found the chest, and behind the mummy is a gem. I mean, it seems to be, so it's like, why separate people out?
But Ross, do you have a situation? Have you ever run in the situation where the people don't separate it out well? I mean, especially in a situation where, like, you see something bad coming, but it puts a hex on you so you can't speak or something like that, or some situation. How do you handle? Do you ever have players who don't handle the line between player knowledge and character knowledge well?
I guess I've been pretty lucky. I haven't had a lot of those kind of issues come up, and if they ever have, it's been fairly simple for me as a GM to say, listen, you guys don't know that. Please disregard,
right.
Until you actually experience it. So I guess I really don't have a lot of useful things to say about that, except that, it's something that you and your group will have to, work with individually. And it's more based on trust, I think, than anything else.
I actually see that as a function of role playing, to be honest.
Yeah.
I don't mind so much when the player, it's always, where that always sneaks in is first aid. We know how to do basic CPR in real life.
Right.
So all of a sudden you have this thick-fingered dwarf who, doesn't have any healing skills. He's like, I staunched the wound. I'm like, I'm not even sure a character would know that. I mean, I think they probably would, but
Right.
you know what I mean? I apply my belt as a tourniquet. Oh, man, would you know that? So it gets too murky. So I think it's a function of role-playing, to be honest. Player knowledge versus character knowledge.
Yeah, and I guess you can always fall back on a skill check or something, right?
Yeah.
Get them that way.
I agree with Rafe. Most of the time this is something you should solve through role playing. And really, is the outcome really going to change the game that much?
Right.
Now, the last one, I think, and this is the hardest one for me, and I'm really looking for your feedback on this, Ross, because I don't know how to deal with it too much. I like all my players to be very focused on the game, but I know a lot of people really like the idea of, talking about the sports scores or whatever, leaving the TV on in the corner, watching the game while you're playing.
No.
How do you deal with that one guy that's always turning the TV on or whatever? I mean, how do you deal with that guy who's always making jokes outside of the game or whatever? Or do you deal with him? How do you handle that?
Well, for the group that I ran with the longest, which is my Maryland group, what we would do is we would schedule about 30 minutes at the beginning of every game, and this was sort of our socialization time. Is we don't see each other that often, so we'd get together and we'd spend about 30-45 minutes just sort of getting it out of our system, and then we'd be ready to go. And people were pretty focused after that. There was a dinner break, after a few hours to help us. Give a little more of a vent for that. But I think that was the way I handled it, and it seemed to work really well for me.
That's a great tip. I like the idea of sort of getting it all out, because you're right. A lot of times when you role play with people, you don't see them very often, and that's part of the challenge. You just want to catch up with your friends.
This was also part of our social contract. Is everybody knew what this time was for?
Nice. Well, that's a good point. Back to the I think that's probably, if you take nothing else away from this episode, I think the idea of getting a set of the contract down in the beginning is probably 90% of all the things we're talking about here, right?
Yeah, that's part of the mandate with Breakfast Gaming Club. We on purpose do not walk in the door, break out a game, and away we go. The first hour to hour and a half to sometimes 2, we just stand around our kitchen counter. We're just all shooting the bull.
Nice. I like that plan. All right, great. Well, Ross, thank you so much for joining us here at Dunk's via Skype from your local Dunkin' or Donut establishment there in Minnesota. Where apparently
thank you, guys. It's been a real honor being here and taking the hit for Craig this time around.
No, I appreciate it. He does too. So I know he wishes he could be here chatting, and I'm sure he's very jealous that he doesn't get to talk to us. But he is on a cruise ship someplace, so don't feel too bad for him.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, thanks again, Ross, and we hope to hear from you again real soon. And we can't wait to see the next goodness coming from Fantasy Flight.
I will. I'm looking forward to hearing the next episode of The Lost Chapters.
Thanks, Ross.
Talk to you.
Thanks for purchasing a D6G Lost Chapter. Supporting the show helps it grow.
Hey, look! The Dungeons and Dragons ride! Wow, neat!
Give me a break.
I don't like this!
Whoa! What's happening?
Whoa! Where are we?
Look out!
Fear not, ranger. Barbarian, magician, thief, cavalier, and acrobat.
Who was that?
That was Venger, the force of evil. I am Dungeon Master, your guide in the realm of Dungeons and Dragons.